Start on time this morning. As a reward for those of you who are up early on a Saturday morning at the end of a long week and prepared to talk about environmental law. So it's a delight to have you. We now have double the number of people in the audience that are on as on the panel, so safe to go. First of all, welcome. I trust that you've had a great week. Unfortunately, I've been unable to be here, but I know some of my fellow colleagues on the panel have. And delighted to see of your interest in a topic that's of particular importance. I suspect that many of you would have attended Edith Brown Weiss's session a couple of days ago. That was almost I think, a preliminary to this panel, in that one of the things that she was talking about was the 40 years that we now have of experience with environmental law. And I think for those of you who've been engaged in the business, you perhaps remember fondly the initial days when we were dealing with things like how to protect the certain species and spaces around the world, really positive things. Moving on then to how on earth we actually try and manage culprits in environmental destruction of one kind or another. And then after Rio, talking about what does it really mean when you talk about sustainable development law. That isn't the same necessarily as environmental law, and so not only what is the nature of the evolving law and the tools that we have to use. And then this morning, our panel is really focusing on something very specific, and that has to do with how do you create laws that are supportive of, if not a catalyst for, a green economy. Assuming that also takes into account social considerations as well as environmental considerations in building those economies. So I think there's a natural progression, and although I didn't hear Edith's panel, she's one of those icons in the field, and I'm sure laid out that path very well. Let me first say what we're going to do this morning is actually allow each of our illustrious panelists to take 8 to 10 minutes or so and present to you a particular thesis of how to answer this question of the effectiveness of international law in greening the economy. And then we're going to allow them to have a bit of an interchange, because I suspect in hearing them you'll find there are some differences of view that perhaps come forth. And then we want to make sure that we have a lengthy period of time so that we can have a conversation with those of you in the audience. So my job is to be the moderator and to try and make sure that we have time for that to happen. Let me just very quickly introduce the people who are with us this morning. We're going to actually start with Dr. Marcus Gehring. Marcus is, in the best sense of the word, an academic. He is currently at the University of Cambridge and is with the Center for European Legal Studies and also the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. All of these three individuals have lengthy CVs, which I won't take up time to elucidate this morning, but simply to say that's Marcus's current endeavor. Dan Esty is at Yale, has been known for his writings in environmental law and policy, particularly related to those things that are concerned with market forces, with the business sector, and of course on trade and competitiveness. And I'm sure many of you will have known Dan in previous roles. And we're very privileged to have Dr. Kamal Hussain, from Bangladesh with us, with the Bangladesh Supreme Court, practicing lawyer, and also known for a lot of the arbitration work that he does internationally. So you can see that we've got a good mix of spheres in which these people are operating, but also regions of the world from which they come. I should have introduced myself. I'm Liz Dowdswell, currently, among other things, CEO of something called the Council of Canadian Academies that does expert panels, organizes expert panels around matters of public policy. So we answer questions like, what's the state of our knowledge about X, Y, Z, from nanotechnology to business innovation? A position that's particularly intellectually stimulating. Watch for a report on shale gas that's coming out momentarily. We just finished one on food security in the north, which is fascinating given the UN rapporteur's report on that. And that's as far as I'll go with respect to doing the sales pitch for the Council of Canadian Academies. My experience is not as a lawyer, although it has been leading negotiations on a number of these topics and trying to make sure that we know what we want to say before we let the lawyers get at it. So I'm the recipient in many ways of some of the work that legal scholars are very much engaged in. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let me turn first of all to Marcus, who's going to tell us a little bit about what he's currently engaged in related to the effectiveness of law that will green the economy.
Yes, thank you very much, Liz. It's always difficult to start a morning, especially after a gala dinner, but I was thinking I could maybe spice up my intervention by saying this is a very exciting moment in the history of the green economy, because I think my main thesis for this short intervention is that we are witnessing a transition that we've seen with regards to the concept of sustainable development many years ago. That is, we have a policy slogan, we have a call to transition to a green economy, and now the lawyers are moving in. So we see a crystallization from a political concept into much more of a legal, tangible concept. And to confirm my thesis, I'm relying on two separate studies that I did with the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, the CISDL. One was to see whether there are any obstacles in international law that would hamper a transition to a greener economy, that would stand in the way of governments. And then another study that we did for the UNEP regional offices, where we surveyed 2,500 laws at the national level in a kind of scorecard system, where we identified laws, innovative approaches that countries are taking in order to facilitate that transition to a green economy. But let me back up a little. We all know the outcome document, the future we want. The Rio +20 outcome document in 2012 said very clearly, albeit in a diplomatic way, we affirm that there are different approaches, visions, models, tools available to each country in accordance with its natural circumstances and priorities to achieve sustainable development in its three dimensions, which is our overarching goal. In this regard, we consider green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication as one of the important tools available for achieving sustainable development, and that it could provide options for policy making, but should not be a rigid set of rules. Shying away from the tricky legal questions. Later, that was paragraph 56. In paragraph 58, they highlight that any tools that countries adopt or make or use for themselves should be adopted in accordance with and consistent with international law. Clearly not lawyers drafting this. I had a student writing a paper what she thought consistency with international law could mean in this context. UNEP had done a study on the green economy and had identified 7 clusters of policy tools, instruments, laws that countries could adopt. It started with green stimulus packages, eco-efficiency measures, greening markets and procurement, investment in sustainable infrastructure, restoration, enhancement of natural capital, getting the prices right, and eco-tax reform. And in all these 7 clusters, we're now seeing laws being adopted, not just in northern, western countries, but all around the world. Right? So, for example, the Maldives have introduced a very stringent packaging taxation regime, right? Really using the economy and economic activity to pursue environmental objectives. We, in our survey for the UNEP regional office, we've identified that this is a global trend. It's not just the European Union or the states of North America or the provinces of Canada adopting innovative tools and really making the transition to a green economy a priority. No, we're seeing countries all over the world, in Africa, in Asia, and especially in Latin America, really taking this concept further and adopting laws to that extent, to the point where we are almost at a point where we can say that certain principles, for example, reduce, reuse, recycle, are becoming general principles of international law because they are so widespread in the legislative framework, sometimes in the constitutional framework, and especially in the jurisprudence of countries. One of the questions that arises from this diverse picture, and the approaches are never the same, but the underlying principles, the underlying approach is very similar in the different jurisdictions. So for example, eco-efficiency standards, legislative approaches to emission trading, forestry standards and sustainable land use regulations, and innovative economic approaches to waste management systems are very widespread all across the world. So the obvious question for any international lawyer is then, are states allowed to do this? Aren't there disciplines in the World Trade Organization under bilateral investment treaties that would maybe stand in the way of this transition to a greener economy, using market instruments instead of command and control in order to regulate for environmental issues? And of course, questions that we already debated this week in the yesterday in the clean energy panel are worth debating, right? Is that perhaps subsidy? Are these laws adopted in a discriminatory manner? Are they really open and transparent? Something investment lawyers always underline. Well, our study that we did with the CISTL has basically demonstrated that there's nothing inherent in investment law, in trade law, in the financial agreements, lending agreements by the World Bank that would stand in the way of a country adopting a green economy approach to its environmental regulation. The devil is, as always, in the detail. Of course, if your aim is to have large parts of these technologies being produced in your own country, if you're using it as a cross-subsidy to create jobs in your own province, that is inherently problematic. But as long as you're adopting a transparent and forward-looking approach to your rules, there's nothing in international trade law or international investment law that would stand in the way of these rules. Now, that is not really an answer whether international law has already moved on to facilitate this transition to a green economy. And we've seen with the Kyoto Protocol that if we have a global framework, then it's much easier for national policymakers to also adopt national laws that maybe just implement these international frameworks. We're still far away from a Paris Accord, but of course, in the transition to a green economy, some form of global climate change agreement would be incredibly helpful, and we've identified that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Some interesting questions, particularly about tools and also about barriers and challenging the common wisdom, I guess. Let me turn next to Kamal to give us his initial thoughts.
Thank you very much. I think it was wonderful that the organizers of this conference chose Cherry Blossom Day as the day when we should be seeing how nature is being affected by climate. And, I was here last month, and everyone said that the climate here has never been like this when everyone was frozen out. And the cherry blossoms were almost frozen out, but happily for us, we are celebrating that day today. The central theme of this conference has been effectiveness of international law, and we have therefore been asked to talk about effectiveness of international law in greening the economy. The question posed is whether, to what extent international law can more effectively facilitate government and private efforts to promote environmentally responsible economic growth. Now, this challenge had come into the global agenda, as you say, 40 years ago, when those who met in Stockholm, the states committed themselves to adopt an integrated and coordinated approach to development, which was compatible with the need to protect and improve the human environment. 20 years later, this challenge was to be systematically taken up by the 160 participating states in the Rio Summit. And they were able to adopt two soft law documents, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development and Agenda 21, both stressing the interconnectedness of environmental and social and economic concerns. The Rio Declaration had recognized the right to development, Principle 3, and poverty alleviation, Principle 5, as key aspects of sustainable development. There was in the declaration a recognition that developed states and developing states were both to adopt policies and strategies, development strategies which protect the environment. Developing countries were expected to do more to change their patterns of consumption and production, which caused environmental harm and compromised the ability of future generations to meet their needs. It has rightly been observed that at the end of 30 years, the legacy of Rio is one of unfinished business. It's of work in progress. Progressive development of international law is a phenomenon, of course, which is part of the international legal order. And in this area, where really the challenges of change, of changing the way national economies are organized and function, and changing the global economy. And we know that certainly the global economy has not delivered what people expect of it. Since 2008, this awareness is now no longer a North-South issue, it is a global issue of how the global economy can be made to function. in a way responsive to the legitimate expectations and needs of people in developing and developed countries. So, now to the legal developments, and I say we are starting with the empty glass. This is, say, 1972. If I fill it up with, say, maybe 1/3 or half, we'll use Edith thing with saying glass is half empty or half full. If you're an irrepressible pessimist, you'll say it's half empty. And if you're an irrepressible optimist, you'll say it's half full. But therefore, the position today about the role of law is that, yes, law has been developing. The challenge of change has been accepted, but it's easier to accept than to deliver. So we have a lot of commitments on paper, a lot of declarations. We call them soft law. There's soft law and even softer law, where it's aspirational. You have stated things, you hope for things, but to get there requires strategies. It requires changing the conduct of states, of corporations, of private entities, of people in farms, of people in factories, and therefore the multi-level, multi-layered legal strategy that you need is extremely challenging, and it's nothing that lawyers can do on their own. This is why interdisciplinary interaction is critical. Scientists must make their contribution, economists must make their contribution, perhaps bankers too, not those who give themselves fat bonuses for making their banks go down the slope, but imaginative bankers can certainly also, through proper credit policies, support sustainable development. So it's not that I think we should rescue this discussion from north-south kind of polarizations. The 60s and 70s have seen too much of that. Happily, in the International Law Association, we eschewed this approach from the very beginning. We said, we are here as scholars, we are here as professionals, we owe it to ourselves not to view things from these polarized view of things. Let's try and see reality as it is. Let us see what has to be changed and in whose interest it is to be changed. I mean, it's too naive to say that all change will benefit everybody. Change by its nature will have a distribution of losses and gains. And unfortunately, the powerful can always ensure that they get more of the gains, and the poor and the weak have to reconcile themselves to what crumbs fall in their way. Now, this is where the orderly change, if you can structure orderly change in a way through a normative framework, which can say, again, equity. This is part of the concept of sustainable development: equity, poverty alleviation, gender equity. These are all elements which are meant to make a better ordering of national orders and ultimately of a global order which will, in a way, be supportive of national orders which are trying to change things for the people who live in them. Now, as I said, the half full part, the Rio Declaration, the Agenda 21. Johannesburg, there were reaffirmations in 2002. Unfortunately, the Earth Charter did not get the kind of acceptance in terms of something which people accepted as creating obligations, although there was a tremendous effort on the part of civil society and others. And Maurice Strong had expressed the hope that in 1995, with the 50th anniversary of the UN, the Earth Charter might be transformed into something of a global foundation for the kind of ecologically responsible world that he had hoped for, dreamt of, and worked for. But that didn't happen because at the last minute in Johannesburg, objections were put in to including anything that would be create obligations. And so the charter was sort of launched in The Hague in 2000. But in 2002, it, as I say, did not get the status that it might have taken us a step forward in terms of a global legal framework for ecology and economy, which were mutually supportive. The International Law Association has persevered, continued to persevere, and adopted a declaration on principles of international law related to sustainable development. which enunciated 7 principles. This was circulated as a UN document in Johannesburg. The 7 principles are the principle of the duty of states to ensure sustainable use of natural resources, the principle of equity in the eradication of poverty, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, the principle of the precautionary approach to human health, natural resources, and ecosystems, the principle of public participation and access to information and justice, the principle of good governance, and 7, the principle of integration and interrelationship, in particular in relation to human rights and social and economic and environmental objectives. The concept of sustainable development was recognized by the ICJ in the Gapchikovo case, and the ICJ linked sustainability concerns to international law. I just quote a paragraph from them because I think, we moved to that point where approaching half full, we're now seeing the interrelationship between law and environment. I use the words of the ICJ. It is clear that the project's impact upon the implication for the environment are necessarily a key issue. Mankind has, for economic and other reasons, constantly interfered with nature. In the past, this was often done without consideration of the effects on the environment. Owing to growing awareness of the risks to mankind for present and future generations, new norms and standards have been developed, set forth in a great number of instruments during the last 2 decades, since Kyoto Protocol, Montreal. Such new norms have to be taken into consideration, and such new standards given proper weight, not only when states contemplate new activities, but also when continued activities which had begun in the past. This need to reconcile economic development and the protection of the environment is aptly expressed in the concept of sustainable development. Now, the effectiveness of international law in greening the economy may be assessed by reviewing the role of international law in protecting the environment and in protecting sustainable development thus far. Because now we are moving into a change of the concepts, because sustainable development is generated certain kinds of adverse responses, so that those who are wanting to see the strategies of change being adopted and carrying forward find that perhaps greening the economy is something that will soften some of that adverse reactions. And it's not just knee-jerk, it's special interests opposing what they think would be injurious to their interests, and then making it appear that, this is finding all sorts of reasons. I mean, one thing, sustainable development is an oxymoron. It's it includes a bundle of different, partly contradictory interests and strategies while giving them a certain legitimacy and coherence. I mean, this is what the critics said about sustainable development. But the same question will arise about greening economy. Just give it a just give them a chance. Those who find ways of undermining the concept of sustainable development will also find something wrong with greening the economy if it touches on those interests which they want protected. But now, currently, green economy is the name of the game. UNEP says the green economy approach seeks in principle to unite under a single banner the entire suite of economic policies and modes of economic analysis of relevance to sustainable development. So greening economy and sustainable development, at least for the UN document for Rio +20 conference, sees the exact connection. Greening the economy is sustainable development oriented. In practice, this covers a rather broad range of literature and analysis, often with somewhat different starting points. UNEP, in its document on Green Economy Initiative, and I again quote them because it encapsulates what I want to say very well, the recent traction for a green economy concept has no doubt been aided by widespread disillusionment with our prevailing economic paradigm, a sense of fatigue emanating from the many concurrent crises and market failures experienced during the first decade of the new millennium, including especially the financial and economic crisis of 2008. But at the same time, we have seen increasing evidence of a way forward, a new economic paradigm, one in which material wealth is not delivered perforce at the expense of growing environmental risks, ecological scarcities, and social disparities. The OECD, in its document on green growth strategy, 2011, underlined that an innovative approach is needed to decouple growth from natural capital depletion. A sense of alarm has begun to be expressed by the looming crisis threatened by global warming and climate change to the planet and humanity in general. Last month, top scientists met in Yokohama to discuss climate change. At the top of their agenda was the threat of rising sea levels by as much as 3 feet by 2100. At the Warsaw Conference last November, it was noted that countries whose existence is threatened are amongst those who produce the least greenhouse gas emissions, as for example my country, Bangladesh. This has led to questioning the dominant paradigm of economic and social development and the recognition of the impossibility of maintaining market fundamentalism to justify a business as usual scenario and allowing unregulated markets to operate. It is rightly argued that proposals to promote a green economy demand effective regulatory frameworks, and that's the role of law, a regulatory role for international law. Today, even those opposed to regulation recognize, even if grudgingly, the need for some regulation, emphasizing always that this should be well designed and not result in heavy-handed bureaucratic intervention. I'd like to close by citing someone that I respect enormously in this context, that is Al Gore, especially sitting in Washington. Some 8 years ago, he shared his sense of alarm in his book entitled An Inconvenient Truth, The Planetary Emergency of Global Warming and What We Can Do About It. I had the privilege of seeing this in movie form in Manhattan. And it was very gratifying that when it all ended, the entire audience stood up and clapped. So ordinary human beings can respond to the challenge of what is threatened. Now, his latest book is something that I want to just quote and conclude because it says basically what I want to share with you. For many years, the effort to achieve a global consensus on action to solve the climate crisis was bedeviled by the international fault lines between rich and poor nations, north-south, with poor countries insisting that the priority they placed on quickly replicating the economic development that had already occurred in wealthy countries meant that they could not afford to participate in a global effort to reduce global warming. Proposed treaties routinely place the first obligation on wealthy countries alone, leaving any requirement on developing nations to future rounds of negotiations. Today, the need for more energy for sustainable economic development is acute. An estimated 1.3 billion people in the world still have no access whatsoever to electricity, and in spite of historic reductions in global poverty, per capita income levels in many energy-poor countries are so low that it is easy to understand why they have resisted any constraints on potential increases in CO2 emissions at a time when the wealthier country has made profligate use of fossil energy during their own past period of economic takeoff. Much has changed, however. The reality of the climate crisis has become much more apparent in developing nations as they experience harsh impacts and struggle to find the resources for disaster recovery and adaptation that are more readily available in developed countries. As a result, many developing countries have now changed their tune and are now actively pushing the world community to take action, even if it means that they too must shoulder part of the burden for responding. And finally, at a news conference 2 weeks ago following its meeting in Yokohama, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned in alarming terms of threats posed by sweeping effects of climate change. Thus, ice caps are melting, sea ice in the Arctic is collapsing, water supplies are coming under stress, heat waves and heavy rains are intensifying, coral reefs are dying, and fish and many other creatures are migrating towards the poles or in some cases going extinct. A World Summit this coming September is to consider a new treaty to limit greenhouse gases. This presents an opportunity and a challenge for international lawyers to take account of these warnings and the inadequacy of the efforts hitherto made in response to the grave threats posed by climate change to the planet and to humanity. We must make creative contributions towards making international law more effective in this vital area of global concern. The challenge is a continuing one, and the challenge must continue to be responded to. I don't see, we'll say that it's 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. It's a continuing struggle. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kamal. A cry for action, clearly. And with that, maybe Dan's got some answers to how one responds to that cry for action. Dan?
Liz, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here and arising early on a Saturday morning to be part of this conversation. And I do want to offer some thoughts, then move to a conversation, because I think there is a lot to discuss on this question of how international law might support what is now a major thrust in many countries, a focus for green growth as kind of the step beyond sustainable development, as each of my fellow panelists has indicated. Because I come from Yale, I never want to stop and focus only on what the law is, but really always focus on what the law should be. And I think that's a theme of this week in some regards here at the conference. And our chairperson, our moderator, indicated that one of the really critical talks of the week was the panel with Edith Brown-Weiss and Nick Robinson, both of whom reflected on 40 years of international environmental law, and there is much to be proud of in that 40 years. An extraordinary number of treaties have been adopted, and it really has helped frame a new element of international law over that 40-year period. But I do think that which was accomplished largely in the 20th century needs to be refreshed and updated and perhaps redirected as we think about a 21st century approach to international environmental law. And that's the framework I want to bring to the conversation today. So first of all, I do think there are some critical roles that international law can play in advancing green growth nationally, globally, and I think even more importantly, locally and at a corporate level. So the first theme that I want to argue that international law can play, or the first role it can play, is to help consolidate norms and guide behavior. And in that regard, I think the 20th century accomplishment is around getting sustainable development on the agenda and widely accepted as a critical framework for understanding what law generally needs to do. We cannot simply optimize short-term results at the expense of longer-term needs. We cannot exploit resources without recognizing that they may be non-renewable. We cannot overfill our ecosystems with waste and pollution for fear that it will burden future generations in ways that would be unacceptable. So I think there has been a base established of sustainable development as a critical foundation for the framework of economic activity broadly, but I think there has been a tendency to silo the environment, and I would argue the norm of the 21st century is a more integrated approach to sustainable development that looks at not just environment on its own, but environment, energy, and economic growth as integrated challenges. So I think the 21st century norm that I would like to see consolidated is this commitment to integration of these agendas. And I think that's the centerpiece of what gets us to promoting green growth. And I do think beyond this focus on integration, there is a need to understand law, international law in particular, having several other potential functions that might serve to support or undermine the push for green growth. And in particular, I think one element of law is to force change, force behavioral modification. Both Marcus and Kamal have noted that as one of the structural elements of law. And I think in this regard, we again have a transition from a 20th century model of law, nationally and internationally, which centered on mandates and really came out of the framework of command and control regulation at the national level. And the international parallel to that was a set of demands in treaties. Now, sometimes this has worked quite well. We have a Montreal Protocol that commanded that we stop putting CFCs into the atmosphere that was breaking down the ozone layer. And that command structure, that mandate in the Montreal Protocol, followed on by amendments that were adopted in London and several other places, did produce a pretty good outcome. We have dramatically reduced the problem of the breakdown of the ozone layer. So I don't want to diminish the success of that command model. It has a place and it has delivered successes. But I think the 21st century approach is going to be somewhat different. It is going to need to have more emphasis on soft law and some other strategies of behavioral modification beyond this command strategy of law forcing behavioral change. And I think one question that we might ask is whether, in fact, the climate change treaty that is on so many people's minds is the transition from a 20th century to a 21st century approach with the limits of the 20th century model now readily apparent. And I think a theme of this conference has been frustration. And I say this with the knowledge that some of us, Liz and I in particular, got to know each other 20 plus years ago negotiating the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And for those who are from the United States of America, the treaty that was adopted in 1992, ratified by the United States, is the last treaty that the United States has signed on to with regard to climate change. So others have taken action beyond, but that treaty has not served to enable or spur the kind of response in the United States that people had hoped for. So I think there are limits to the targets and timetables approach, to the mandate approach, and frankly to the top-down command and control regulatory strategy, and especially one that is state-centered. So I think that does lead us to looking at a third role that law can play, international law as well as national law, and that is market enabling and corporate behavior channeling structures of international law. And I think this is where there is enormous opportunity to develop a 21st century international environmental law that perhaps will get us farther down the track of action on these critical issues, starting with climate change, but addressing a range of other green issues beyond. And I think we've seen some of the shoots of this new 21st century international environmental law beginning to emerge and being discussed here over the last few days. I note that there have been those who wanted to see, Ricardo Melendez, for example, in a panel yesterday, a green trade agreement that would promote more quick dissemination of cutting-edge technologies in the clean energy arena in particular. And I think that is promising, and I think the WTO law, trade law more broadly, has demonstrated that it can be helpful to green growth by its market-enabling strategies and structures, ensuring that we do not have protectionism and obstruction of free trade inhibiting the dissemination of energy efficiency, renewable power, and other green technologies that might be benefited, that might benefit the world if they were pushed out across more countries. Now, I want to stop and pause and say that the trade arena is not without challenges as well. One of the things that we've seen is the push to open markets is challenged when some of the people competing in those markets are not held to the same standards as the producers in other places. So we have, and Marcus has highlighted this, significant issues around China's participation in wind turbines and photovoltaic cells, where there are significant questions about whether the production processes meet global standards of fair competition. So I think the trade arena and the trade law structure can both open markets and enable the expansion of a green economy, but could also be used as a mechanism for inhibiting trade or undermining the free flow of goods and services. So I think there is a very interesting area of work to be undertaken in terms of how international law might optimally promote green growth, and recognizing that there are some tensions that need to be worked out between what the fair terms of production are, whether we're trying to optimize manufacturing activity, or whether we're also interested in the installation and services of green technologies as well as their production. So I do think there is an element there to be worked through. And I think we see emerging this new framework of international environmental law for the 21st century that is now going to be more bottom-up, more focused on soft law guiding of behavior than hard law mandates, is really a break from the command and control past and reflects evolution in environmental law at the national level as well. In particular, I'm thinking about the growing recognition that information and indicators and metrics can be very useful in guiding critical elements of behavior that shape whether we have a green economy or not. In particular, consumer behavior. Does the public buy goods that are environmentally preferable? Do they have the information to even know what is environmentally preferable? And second, guiding investors in understanding which companies are on a long-term sustainable trajectory and may outperform their competitors over time because they are reflecting this broader principle of sustainable development. So I think there is a role for international law in facilitating the flow of information, the benchmarking of performance, the establishing of methodologically rigorous data that is comparable not only across countries, but increasingly importantly, across companies, so that we can really understand these market players and use a framework of law to help guide, again, both consumer behavior and investor behavior. So I do think there's some lessons here as we look out at the next set of challenges, particularly, as several people have noted, the push for a new step on climate change in Paris at the end of 2015. I think there is a need to recognize that we've got to move beyond a state-centered international law to one that not only guides states, but frankly, subnational jurisdictions, provinces, and states in the small s sense of states of the United States or Mexico. I think beyond that, cities are going to be a critical place where action needs to be driven and perhaps induced by a structure of international law that calls out performance, has a way to compare behavior, provides benchmarking and scorecarding, and induces a healthy competition where people are seeking to move towards best practices and where we can capture those best practices and disseminate them more broadly. And even beyond a focus on government, I do think the framework of 21st century law and 21st century environmental law in particular needs to engage the corporate sector in a much more vigorous way, because it's the corporate sector that has so much of the decision making that determines whether we're on a sustainable trajectory or not. So I look for more in the way of soft targets rather than hard mandates. I look for more in the way of data to allow us to gauge performance, particularly benchmarked against relevant peer groups. So you don't benchmark Bangladesh against Sweden, but you do ask, who are the peers of Bangladesh? Who should we compare the Bangladesh successes to? And you don't compare ExxonMobil to Coca-Cola, or for that matter to Microsoft. You have industry clusters that help you establish what performance should look like in particular sectors. And I think there's a role for law, both nationally and internationally, to establish that framework and facilitate that scorecarding. And finally, I do think we can use this structure to harness market forces, the pressure of competition, to help drive costs of renewable energy down, to drive down the cost of efficiency. There is, and this is a lesson I've drawn from 3 years in government that I've just concluded, the public's interest and willingness to engage in the fruits of the green economy varies directly with the premium to be paid for that environmentally superior product. If clean energy costs 10% more than the fossil fuel status quo, lots of people come with you. If it costs twice, 3 times, or 5 times the cost, as we are seeing in Europe, in Germany, in Spain, the public's tolerance will be strained and there will be a backing away. So it is critical that we harness competitive pressures into service of the green economy, and particularly of delivering cheaper and cleaner renewable power, cheaper and cleaner efficiency out over time, and corporate performance more broadly. So let's look for a 21st century that is got an environmental law that's different from the 20th century, that is bottom up more than top down, that is soft law more than hard law, that is using information, tools, and technologies to help guide both consumers and investors, and is seeking to support and enable the green growth that almost every government, not only nationally, but at the state, provincial, and municipal level, is seeking to produce. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dan. Clearly, all three of you have implicitly, if not explicitly, indicated that while there has been some progress and some effectiveness with international law on environmental issues, clearly there's a need for change. And that was a focus certainly of Kamal's presentation. The fact that we are living in not only a period of blurring sovereignty, great interdependence, but also blinding technological change. And one of the things that you didn't specifically touch on is the sheer pace of change, and whether the way in which we currently develop international regimes of law can cope with that pace of change that is so apparent, particularly on the technology side, from the hard technologies through to through information technologies, for example. But you've heard that, in fact, effectiveness is measured, and it's looking positive in a number of the countries, as Marcus has described in his study. And yet, you've heard the cry from Dan that there needs to be a fundamental shift in the nature of what we call international law if it's going to realize the promise or contribute to the promise of a green economy. Let me take just a couple of moments before we open it up for general conversation to allow each of you to comment on anything that your fellow panelists have said, either that you challenge or that you want to reinforce. Marcus?
I mean, it's very difficult for me not to agree with both Kamal and Dan. Dan wrote over almost 20 years ago that greening the GATT is not just something we need to think about, but rather something we need to act on very forcefully. And he proposed a whole list of things, many of which have actually found their way either by way of WTO jurisprudence or by way of policy submissions into the legislative framework of trade law. I think we're moving beyond just greening economic law, investment, or trade into a new paradigm where we really, as Kamal suggested, rethink how our economic structure is working. Right? I'm from a region in Germany where almost 50% of our energy is produced by renewables. With the dying shipping industry, you created windmills, you created work, and that even led to a shift in agricultural production to more sustainable agriculture, because you have a steady revenue income stream through these windmills on your fields, and you can still use the fields, of course. I think it's a fantastic promise that for which we need the international legislative framework to facilitate that shift to a greener economy.
Kamal?
No, I'm very heartened by our discussion, because I was saying that, one of the first things is to rescue ourselves from a north-south type of, debate. And I'm happy to see that basically there is a fundamental consensus on the imperative for change. The world as it is going on cannot continue. It must change. And certainly 21st century is something that we should see as the century which will carry us forward. 20th century was not a bad century in terms of change. I mean, if you look at 48, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, from a world previously which was divided between colonies and non-colonies, between civilized nations and uncivilized nations. So 48 marked a change, and there was a forward movement. So, we should carry over that, and of course all of these things that have happened, sustainable development, Rio, Stockholm, these are all the legacies of the 20th to the 21st, and we should welcome them, what our predecessors have left for us. But then as we look to the future, and the younger generation is what we all talk about, but again, I think that Edith Brown's section was very good, because the young people were in a very proactive mode there. They were putting all the difficult questions. And ultimately it was, yes, with improved communications, more information, which I entirely agree with Dan, that the greater information, and ultimately our naive belief that truth must ultimately prevail, because so much of those who, special interests, which protect special interests, do so by concealing the truth, by distorting the truth, by denying the truth to those who knew them would not, adopt policies or strategies which they do. So I think I entirely agree that 21st century, more information, more in-depth studies to see what makes a particular recommendation, policy, law, strategy effective. And that's why I again would eschew the language of the 20th century in terms of hard and soft law. It's effective and ineffective law. Which is hard, which is soft, what will work? Now, take smoking, for example. I have no doubt that the campaigns, saying, don't pass your own death sentence by buying this packet of cigarette is good. But I'm sure that the legal hard law has also helped when you see all the people standing on the pavement and not being able to smoke inside. That has brought about change. So hard and soft have complemented each other. So it's effectiveness versus ineffectiveness. If hard is effective, please let us use hard law. If it is not effective, as you say, of course, let's move to something else. So effectiveness is the right word. We want effective laws in the 21st century to deal with what we want, which is change in the interests of all.
Well, at the risk of agreeing rather than stirring up controversy and producing the debate that you all came for, I think Kamal is right that effectiveness is the real test. And I think it is perhaps the case that some of us, having watched international environmental law move in what has been a frustratingly slow pace of progress over the last 20 years, are now concerned about the hard law model. And I totally accept Kamal's suggestion that let's use it where we can. There will be some places where the consolidation of views, the consensus is broadly available. But I do think it is interesting that we have seen so little progress on climate change, and at the same moment, let me add, seen so little progress in the trade arena. We have had a Doha round that's gone on and on and on. We're in stuck mode in a number of international law contexts. So I think my call for a 21st century international law that's different from the 20th century is application beyond the environmental arena, has application in international economic law. I think it frankly acknowledges a reality which perhaps many of us in the 20th century thought we had moved beyond, which is the tenaciousness of nationalism. We thought maybe there was a way to create legislative structures that would work at a broader scale. And I guess I am pessimistic about being able to do that in a number of arenas. So I do think a shift away from command and control as the core vision toward market-enabling norms and processes, away from a kind of targets and timetables starting point for international environmental law to a metrics, benchmarking, scorecarding, comparative performance mode, away from a focus on national governments alone to the full spectrum of governments across many scales and to the corporate approach and corporate performance, does offer some promise for getting us out from under being stuck. And I would argue, by the way, that it may help in the trade and other arenas as well as the environmental one.
Just before I turn to the audience, at the risk of being a little controversial, I guess underlying all of these hopes for change and patterns of change, I guess the fundamental question is, do we actually have consensus about what it is we want to achieve in the first place? I think we can talk about the methods used, but I wonder if our slowness, our inability to be as effective as we want to be, isn't in fact rooted in the lack of a common purpose about what it is, what kind of world we really want to see. And I'm not sure that we have agreement on that around the world. But that being set aside, let me turn to the floor now. And might I ask that you actually stand, because I can't see with these lights in front of me, but also would you tell us who you are and perhaps direct your question to one of the panelists.
Understand that we're recording, so we need a microphone. We do. Thank you.
First, I would have to say I'm glad we're recording because this was an absolutely brilliant panel. Thank you. Really one of the most exciting and interesting, indeed fascinating discussions I've seen on this topic, and I've seen a few. I'm Dr. Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger. I'm the Senior Director of the Centre for International Sustainable Development Law and also a Fellow of the Lauderpacht Centre in Cambridge. But I'm going to ask my question from the perspective of an intergovernmental organization that brings together the justice sector, the justice ministries, the International Development Law Organization. because we've been struggling for 4 years to implement programming called legal preparedness for the green economy in the 60 bottom billion countries of the world, including, of course, with Kamal in Bangladesh. And what I'd like to ask the panel is actually really just not a comment, not even, I'm afraid, a good controversial disagreement with what they're saying, but a more. I'd like to hear from you first how you think that the world's push to agree global sustainable development goals can help us, in the softest of contexts, to answer that toughest question that Elizabeth has just put in terms of agreeing where we want to go. Because where I work, those sustainable development goals, previously the MDGs, were shaping the poverty reduction strategy that depended and decided whether or not you got funding from overseas development agencies, from foreign direct investors, from others, for the investment you wanted in your country, green or not green. So I think that's a piece I'd like to hear from the panel on. The other two pieces, just as simple and just as obvious. In terms of the multilateral environmental accords that we have struggled to agree on with many, many diverse conditions, Dan, that was absolutely fascinating, the benchmarking against peers instead of impossible comparisons. And I'd like to hear how you think other international agreements besides climate change, which is the elephant in the room for sure, but biodiversity, desertification, migratory species, endangered species, could also be contributing better to the greening of the economy. Last but not least, anyone who knows me probably not be surprised. Yeah, international investment law and the financial laws that are now increasingly being shaped by global, more than just gentlemen's agreements, but actual expectations and possibly even rules. How, with the new chapters that we're adopting on renewable energy or organic agriculture in regional trade agreements, how, with the corporate social responsibility standards that we're putting into our investment treaties, can we, again, support the greening of the international economy? Thank you.
I think that's really unfair. She got to ask 3 questions. But let me turn, Dan, at least one of those was specifically directed to you.
So I'll try 1.5 of them, and we'll let the rest of the panel answer others. With regard, and Liz, this is really your question too, about whether we are so lacking in a consensus on the direction we want to go, the fundamental vision, that all the rest of this is almost beside the point. I am not so pessimistic. Again, having spent the last 3 years working as a government official, trying to bring together diverse political viewpoints in pursuit of a greener future, I think there are quite broad agreements at the highest level. In particular, in the arena we're discussing, I think the public wants a cleaner, greener economic future. I think the issue comes when you have to trade that off against the cost of doing so. And that's why I put such emphasis on harnessing market forces and on using these other tools to narrow the premium that has to be paid for the green path to the economic future. And I really do believe if you can reduce that premium to a modest amount, you would get a pretty broad consensus. Never 100%, but you could get 80% of the public to go with you on that agenda. So that's my answer to the question of vision. I think you can have a common vision, and it breaks down in the implementation, but there are ways to mitigate that. Second, with regard to this issue of peer groups and why that's important, it turns out that people are not motivated by comparisons that are not meaningful. And you know, it is a lesson I've drawn from now 15 years of working on what we call the Environmental Performance Index, a benchmarking tool looking at country performance on 19 different metrics of both environmental public health and ecosystem protection. And I think you do need to differentiate on relevant factors. And by the way, it's not always the position in terms of economic strength or sustainable or of economic development. So in some regards, you want to compare countries on that. But if you are looking at issues like desertification, you don't want to put even rich countries on the same scale, because the circumstances of the United Arab Emirates and Germany are very, very different. So you would actually want to benchmark countries that are in desert conditions against each other, and there is where you're going to find leaders, laggards, competition, and the search for best practices producing useful information.
Marcus?
Yeah, I think the SDGs are helpful. I'm slightly skeptical whether they're the only answer to a transition to a green economy. I think we now see that at the national level, countries are starting to adopt strategies that incorporate these global objectives, and I think that's a very positive move. Dan, I think, answered the multilateral environmental accord question. There's often now a debate whether all developing countries are really in the same boat, and I think that is a useful debate to be had. I think a lot of developing countries are not in the same category. I think some industrialized countries are really not facing very similar circumstances. There's perhaps a role for regional integration projects. I specialize in EU law, and what sovereign member states of the European Union have achieved with regards to greening their economies and environmental legislative approaches is truly remarkable. Could perhaps not be replicated as such in other parts of the world, but is perhaps going some way towards distinguishing between different groups of countries. I think corporate social responsibility is becoming more and more important. Procedural approaches to greening the economy are becoming more important for banks and financiers. If you don't have an impact assessment that is meaningful, you can no longer get large-scale financing from anywhere. And I think it's those economic and financial levers that we need to use more and enshrine in legislative frameworks.
Thank you. No, I think 2 points. One is from Marie-Claire, and what you said about consensus. It's right in a way that, you have consensus at a very abstract level, but then when you come down to the next level of specifics and the diversity of interests, and as Marx pointed out, diversity between countries and within countries. So to get a level of consensus which embraces all the different interests is very challenging, and the law, if it has to be effective, has to be preceded by a kind of in-depth analysis of the interests affected, the distribution of losses and gains, because anything that you do in terms of affecting human activities will benefit some and not benefit others. And the distribution of gains has to be relatively balanced for it to have broad support. And with that broad support, you get the kind of consensus which would bring the kind of laws, hopefully, which would allow shared objectives. We talk about shared objectives. But if there is that much diversity that you don't accept that you are not willing to give up certain interests because you think that you are dug into it, what you call vested interests. So unless vested interests are willing to get divested of those interests, and for that it's much more complicated than just study, it's campaigning. And as I say, I agree, government is not the answer, but then nor are corporations, because corporations also have interests. But you think of what we call civil society, NGOs, different groups of citizens who, they also have an interest, human interest, but it's not narrowly focused self-interest. So community interest, human interest, if you like, in a broader sense, those that can nurture that organization, and I would put our professional associations. I mean, I take pride in something like the International Law Association, because I honestly say that, we overcame the North-South divide when in Paris you are having the North-South dialogue, and people saying we confront each other. Because we had, what I did, and it's one of these economic law things which I was sharing, I said, look, I'm from the South, give me the Northern brief. Let me see if I can advocate it. And Oscar Schachter was with us, Gunther Jennecke was with us, and I said, you take over the advocacy of the South. And it was brilliant. The South got much better advocacy than the North.
Okay, other questions? Yes.
I'm Steve Wolfson from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and GW Law School. I'd like to thank the panel and ask, I wanted to pick up on the theme of market-enabling solutions and ask about the prospect for linking markets across national boundaries, both in order to broaden participation and also possibly to leverage funding for green development. But in particular, to address, for Dan and the other panelists to address the issues this raises in terms of capacity, in terms of data reliability and comparability, and in terms of compliance infrastructure.
Okay.
So just a quick thought on that. I believe this issue of capacity and of methodological rigor in getting data that can actually be used for scorecarding for comparison is a serious one. And frankly, in some countries it is a lack of capacity. In others, it's actually intentional manipulation of data to meet political targets and needs and other purposes. So I do think this is actually a very valuable role in order to make an international system work. Just as you have accounting rules that make stock markets work, you can't actually have a stock market if people have different standards of what a profit is. I think you can't have an international system that works if people have a different standard of what air pollution is. And so I do believe a critical role for governance at the global scale is methodological consistency, establishing standards that will be reported against, and then actually providing some verification mechanism to check that data. And I think there are models to work with here in the international arena, because I know this goes to some people's view of sovereignty and could be very threatening. But the OECD has done extremely interesting national country reports, where an audit team comes in and reviews performance and provides a kind of a report card, which countries that are mature accept and don't always agree with everything, but always accept it as useful to have someone hold a mirror up and tell you how you look. And how much people take of that and how much people are willing non-defensively to absorb the lessons that are being offered varies enormously. But I think that's the model for the future in the global setting.
If I can just add a comment, I think one of the real challenges is that even the most developed of countries have been systematically removing or defunding opportunities to actually collect data and information and make it available. Particularly any pretense of longer-term records are being destroyed, and that's a real challenge. You may have the standards at the international level, but systematically, many of the attempts to get information are being destroyed at the national level.
And Liz, if I could just add to that, I think the work you're doing and the work that national academies do turns out to be incredibly important for exactly this reason. It's a force against data and analysis becoming politicized and being defunded or undone simply because it might be unattractive in the results it produces. And I do believe that what we're tapping into in this discussion is a very fundamental principle of good science, and that is peer review. You need to have a process by which your assumption about what is correct or true or the right direction to go is tested. And this is fundamental to knowledge progress as it has been defined for 500 years. And I think it's late coming to the environmental arena, but time we get it there and lock it down.
I'm going
Just
to...
one word, transparency.
Absolutely.
Very helpful.
Absolutely. I'm going to take 2 or 3 remaining questions and then ask the panel to comment because I know we're rapidly going to run out of time. So we've got one question here. Yes.
Thank you. My name's Sarah Seck. I'm with the Faculty of Law at Western University in Ontario. And I wanted to start by saying I very much appreciated your comments, and I do a lot of work in corporate social responsibility and business and human rights, so I think the comments in that area are right on. My comment and question is more based on sort of personal experience as somebody who lives in Ontario and in Canada. And that is to say that within all of this, of course, there's a lot of language in green economy about the importance of consumers and consumer choices. But governments do also matter, and which governments get elected often depends on the promise they can give to citizens of jobs. And my frustration in Canada is that at a federal level, we have a government that is very enthusiastic about oil sands development and very much talks about jobs and doesn't have any interest really in climate. And at a provincial level in Ontario, we have a government that put forth the Green Energy Act, which has run into, of course, trade issues. It has attempted to both address climate and jobs at the same time, which is what enabled it to get elected, and yet has run into frustrations through trade law rules because it didn't do it right. And this is sort of another layer I just want to put on the table. We have an environmental bill of rights in Ontario, so the green energy proposals, the wind in particular, have run into a lot of issues because we rightly allow for appeals based on concerns over environmental health and human health concerns, but also species at risk. So there's sort of a sense that here's a government that's really been trying to do something right in this area, and yet because we provide environmental rights protection, it's run into some frustration in trying to sort of move this industry forward. And then because of trade rules, there's this sort of added layer. And yet, on the other hand, our federal government seems to not be having any difficulties. So I guess there's a lot wrapped into that, but maybe workers, voters, how do we build that into the green economy?
And another couple of questions, if there are. Yes. There's one up front here as well.
Kiran Sadhav, Georgetown University Law Center. With regard to voluntary commitments to deliver concrete results for sustainable development, what are some effective ways to ensure compliance, in particular for corporate entities? Thank you.
Thank you. And one last one up here. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Anna Koswiersma from the University of Denver. I just have a question of how we address the problem that increasingly the desire for soft law isn't just in the form of pushing for sort of soft law for targets or timetables, but also increasingly soft commitments on monitoring and verification. And that's tied in with a great deal of distrust, partly because of the North-South divide, but a great deal of distrust in international organizations that might provide that standardization. So I'm just curious your response. I think there are some big challenges to relying on the soft law approach, just as there are big challenges to assuming we can do everything with hard law. If there's no commitment to any kind of, I don't know if it's binding, but sort of form of binding verification procedures or real commitment to substantive reporting and not just procedural reporting, then how do we move forward? Thanks.
And I can't resist because
Okay.
you're so enthusiastic.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm John Farmer from Columbia Law School, and I'm a visiting scholar there. My question is: we know that the green economy most occasionally mostly depend on green technologies. So my question is: what role will the international intellectual property regime concerning the green technology to play in the green economic growth? And we know that most developing countries lack the ability to develop the green technology most occasionally. So how to share the technology and such the need the international legal regime? Okay, thank you.
Okay. So, panelists, can you pick and choose which one of those you wish to answer and also wrap in your concluding remarks? And Kamal, I'll start with you this time.
No, taking this last point about transfer of technology, the technologies that are needed for greening the economy must be facilitated, and there the question, the market must be getting the right kind of signals. And the whole point about sensitive lawmaking, effective lawmaking, is that it doesn't obstruct the market. It facilitates the achievement through the market of what are the desirable social objectives. Now, no one has actually mastered this, I'm sorry to say. I mean, 40 or 50 years as a lawyer tells me that, you know, you're told this is the kind of law you need, but no one gets it right. I mean, if you look at the struggle that has gone on since 2008 to get employment going, to get the economies revived and so on, it's a continuing effort. So this is why I say the transfer of technology is very important, all levels of technology, because the challenge is such that it needs to have sharing of knowledge. And if knowledge is made something that the flow of which is obstructed, then you are certainly obstructing what we all need, which is moving towards bringing about change, for which you need the knowledge, which needs to be shared. And so I would be happy to see what Dan would suggest in terms of how the market can be encouraged to encourage free flows. And what he also said was that that integrity in terms of the information that is made available. I mean, he talked about accountants and the rules they have to follow. Now we know that so much of the sorrows that we are now having to nurse because of the economic failures of the market are because those rules are not observed. There are rules, but they are not observed in terms of transparency. And that's what I said. The object is that everybody should be made aware and not have material information suppressed. Thank you.
Yes. Well, there's lots to say. I wanted to make one brief comment on Steve's intervention about linking markets. I think someone said it's easier to create a world currency than to create a world emission trading scheme. But they said that about the European emission trading scheme as well, and it, for all extent and purposes, works reasonably well. I think if lawyers are involved, you can actually work out those kind of linkaging issues. I wanted to comment on Vanessa's intervention from Western Ontario, saying that the federal government in Canada is playing with the future of Canada. I think there are huge liability issues, and your federal government is mortgaging Canada's economic and environmental future. I would link that to, the tobacco industry, thinking, oh, we just exploit the oil sands and let's not worry about making people sick and wasting all our drinking water on the oil sands. I think it's a terrible, terrible decision, and it's going to come home to roost. I think the Ontario government is much more sophisticated in its approach, and yes, they were subsidizing the Ontario jobs. That shouldn't be done. You could have done it slightly differently. Trade law has also helped to bring about change in Canada, for example, in asbestos. We've seen Canada lose the Seal case, I think rightly so. So there are some beacons of hope also for Canada. I think the market should dictate how we use corporate social responsibility. If a company lies about their commitment, they should be penalized by the market. And if the market doesn't penalize then securities regulators should. Because saying something in your public statements and then not doing it is, in my view, as bad as lying in your corporate accounts. So sooner or later, we will actually see that these corporate social responsibility commitments will be picked up by accountants and by securities regulators. And I think that's the right way forward. To Annika, I just wanted to quickly say, I don't understand the sort of deep mistrust in developed countries for developing countries, right? So why do we believe that the EPA does everything wonderfully, even though they occasionally lose Supreme Court cases, whereas in developing countries, the environmental ministry must be always corrupt and can never function properly? I think we need to, as international lawyers, help to educate our governments that that is not the case, that you have very dedicated environmental ministries who really live up to international standards in developing countries.
So very quickly, as I know we're running out of time, several of the questions did involve compliance and whether my push for more data and benchmarking is at risk if that too is too soft. And I think that's a fair point. I do think, first, that the idea of a soft strategy that simply benchmarks and scorecards has real promise, because in the modern day of great transparency, no president or prime minister likes to show up at a meeting low on the scorecards. It's embarrassing. And you would be surprised how powerful a motivation that is. And no environment minister wants to show up at the meetings of environment ministers with subpar performance. And I believe the same is true in the corporate setting, particularly as you benchmark in an industry cluster. The consumer goods companies compete vigorously with each other, and they know the public in some regards and the investors in other regards are watching, and they cannot afford to ignore these issues. Having said that, Kamal used a word that I guess I should have used and I like, and that is integrity. What we really need is the integrity of our environmental reporting just as much as our accounting. And frankly, Kamal's correctly pointed out that the lack of integrity is not limited to the environmental arena. It was the source of our 2008 economic meltdown. Hidden realities that were not brought forth by the accounting structure or were absolutely falsified. And I think that remains a risk and one that we should vigorously defend against. And I guess my only hope is that in a world of growing transparency, there are lots of cross-checks. And increasingly, it's impossible to hide bad news. Ask General Motors that's going to take $1 billion valuation hit because somebody hid the need for a recall. Last thought on the green technology and technology development point, which I think is a very good one. I think at the centerpiece of the structure that we're trying to create of law and incentives is the desire for innovation, but not limited to technology development. I think we need innovation in our framework of incentives, in our policies. I think we need real innovation in how we finance the green economy and clean energy in particular. And the Green Bank that Connecticut launched a couple of years ago may be a model in that regard. But beyond that, we need innovation in how we engage the public, how we market clean energy, how we ensure that everyone has this available, how we really transform the structure of the current regime toward a future that is the 21st century. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dan. I think ultimately the premise behind this whole week of meetings is actually that ultimately our mutual interdependence means that we're mutually vulnerable, and we do have to work together in that context. One of the things that I'm pleased about this morning is that we have implicitly addressed everything from legitimacy to act, public trust, purposeful leadership, all of those things that are critical to making that happen. And it's really quite appropriate, I think, that the two I words that got mentioned just in this last exchange, the issue of innovation, which is full of promise and hope, and the issue of integrity, which does allow us to deal effectively with all of our citizens and meet that test of equity around the globe, is so important. So may I, on your behalf, thank Dan, Marcus, and Kamal, and thank all of you for participating in this morning's conversation.